Dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I accepted the invitation to speak here today about the years of professional academic cooperation with Johann Kotzblum. In fact, I am more than happy to speak about my friendship with Johann, whom I called Job, as nearly everyone. Delivering on this welcome opportunity is, however, not without risk, as my rather private view of a historical process poses, of course, some methodological problems. After all, I speak as a contemporary witness and on my own behalf. Also more so, as a lot, especially for the first 10 years, has to be fed from memory, since there are no written sources. Memory, in turn, requires narration, which further complicates personal access. My narrative begins in September 1965, when I first met Norbert Elias in Münster railway station, where Dieter Claessens, who had invited Elias to Münster for a guest semester, introduced me as a student assistant who was to look after him for the next few months. At that time, I had not heard the name Johann Kotzblum. This was soon to change because Elias told us of a Dutchman who had already read his book on the process of civilization in the mid-1950s and had to address him at the World Congress in Amsterdam in 1956. So I had probably heard the name by the winter of 1965-66, but had no idea about the person. I did not get to know Job until 1967, when I visited Elias in Amsterdam, where he worked as a visiting professor. Elias and Job took me for dinner at an Indonesian restaurant. Other such encounters followed from time to time over the next 2 or 3 years, but it was always in the wake of meetings with Elias. Even in 1969, when Job took part in the authors' colloquium organized by the Center for Interdisciplinary Research of the University of Bielefeld in Rederkasse, with Elias about his habilitation thesis, Die Höfische Gesellschaft, finally published that year, I exchanged no more than few polite words with him. I was responsible for the event going on smoothly, so I had to stay in conversation with all participants. Also in 1969, a second edition of Über den Prozess der Zivilisation was published, unfortunately in a sinfully expensive linen edition in a slipcase. But 2 central works by Norbert Elias were now available again. As a result, the reception gradually increased in momentum, content, and intensity. In addition, there were first interviews, such as the one with Job in 1970 in the Hits, or in April 1974 on the occasion of a first French edition of the process in Les Nouvelles Observateurs. Now there were first conferences and my contact with Job intensified. I also went to Amsterdam to visit him and discuss more recent essays. This made the contact more personal because Job's wife, Maria, also took part in the discussion. Maria had an important role in the House of Kotzblum. While Job sat in solitude and freedom in his first floor study, Maria organized family life and contact with the everyday world on the ground floor. Soon enough, my wife Elke began to accompany me, Maria, and she quickly developed a good personal rapport. 2 independent women, both studied, both politically active. Maria at Amnesty International, Elke in local politics, and soon also in the leadership of the German Social Democratic Women's Organization. Our encounters did not stop at the discussion of the work of the ever-present master. Literature, exhibitions, and events were natural subjects of our meetings at the kitchen table around which the house of Kotzebue was centered. On the piano stood the songbook of Tom Lehrer, a Harvard mathematician who performed socio-political songs to fabulous piano playing. Elke and I soon found a shop in Berlin where we could buy his records. To this day, we sometimes jokingly quote the chorus of the song about American foreign policy. So if in doubt, send the Marines. In addition to the increasing public interest in Norbert Elias' publications, there were another reason for Joop and me to intensify our cooperation. In June 1977, he would be 80 years old, and when asked how to celebrate his birthday, the plan for a conference arose, eternalized with a Festschrift edited by Joop, Peter Gleichmann, and myself. In the spring of 1975, Elke and I visited the Kurzblum family in Constance, where Joop had a visiting professorship for one semester. Since the children were not yet required to end school, Maria, Clara, and Frank were able to come to Constance. We certainly talked about the commemorative publication, looked at who we already had promises from, and who still had to be addressed, and by whom. Little did we know that a major problem would soon arise. In the autumn of 1975, members of the Department of Sociology of the University of Leicester published a textbook. In the foreword, they thanked Ilya Neustadt, the head of the department, and described him as the founder of developmental sociology. Elias was briefly mentioned as he had given introductory courses. The authors had taken the side of the more powerful who could promote their careers. However, the facts were turned upside down, as Elias was undoubtedly the spiritus rector. He was not only deeply offended, but rightly extraordinarily angry. He informed us that he would not accept the Festschrift if even one of the Leicester group would contribute to it. Only his favorite student, Eric Dunning, was exempted from the ban. How unstructured the Elias scene was at that time can be seen from this fact that this prohibition plunged us, Joop, Peter Gleichmann, and me into dire straits. We just could not foresee the consequences of the Leicester scandal. We also suspected that those included could plan their own Festschrift publication. We decided to clarify the matter on the spot and traveled on our own expense, accompanied by our wives, over a long weekend in January of '76 to Leicester. We stayed at the Belmont Hotel and met the Leicester colleagues on Sunday morning in a pub that was cold as it was smoky. It quickly became clear that this group was unable to act, and some were frightened by Elias's harsh reaction. In the evening, we went to the Indian restaurant recommended by Elias for chicken tandoori. From today's point of view, the trip at that time is difficult to understand, but it had a function that should not be underestimated for us, as it strengthens our cohesion. The intense conversations on the train rides brought us closer together and made things easier in the future. The pool of shared memories began to fill up, strengthening the emotional foundation, especially between Joop and me. 20 months later, the sparsely unknown outsider Elias had become the shooting star of the scene. In the summer of 1976, Suhrkamp published the paper edition of Über den Prozess der Zivilisation. It became a bestseller. In June 1977, we were able to present the Festschrift, Human Figurations, at a birthday conference in Aachen. In October of the same year, Elias received the first Theodor W. Adorno Prize of the city of Frankfurt in the famous Paulskirche. What followed were invitations from around the world, of which Elias could accept but a few for organizational reasons. Yet he accepted to come to the University of New York after making sure that Joop and I were also invited. So we went to New York in spring of 1978. I cannot go into the details of this somewhat strange event here today. Let me just relate an episode that Joop and I could laugh about ever since. Together with Elias, who had been invited for dinner, we had been invited for dinner by Louis Koser, one of the big shots of North American sociology at the time. With us in a restaurant on Rhode Island was an assistant named Dr. Wallace. There were fabulous scallops and most stimulating conversation. Koser and Elias conversed in their refugee English with heavy accent. They probably felt it somehow improper to speak in their native German. Koser paid the bill for everyone. But Dr. Wallace took Joop and me aside at the exit and told us that the invitation was only for Elias. He had to collect $25 from us, each of us. The next day, on the way to a party, we joked about whether tickets would be sold at the entrance. It is such episodes that form the basis for the friendly relationship between Joop and me. There was also no jealousy, as we both had a share in sociology and no reason to envy the other. We were companions of a time together that demanded all kinds of things from us. Towards the end of the 1970s, we were busy organizing conferences, editing anthologies, always keeping Elias's wishes in mind, who lived at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Bielefeld since 1978, but needed support during lecture tours. We also organized a major international conference at SIF for his 85th birthday, before we set about preparing the celebration for his 90th birthday. From a sociological point of view, a certain hierarchy had developed at the latest since the Adorno Prize. Here, those who organized, invited, financed. There are those who wanted to be invited and had to be financed. It did not fail that not everyone was always completely happy with these conditions. Turns out there are always differences between self-assessment and external assessment, but we were able to arrange most of it in a friendly manner. This remains the case after Norbert Elias started the foundation named after him in February 1983. The plan had been in place for some time, but the foundation all the same came as a surprise. I, for one, knew nothing about the appointment with the notary signing the foundation documents. In the months before, I had managed to convince Elias not to set aside 80% of wealth and income for a prize in Menschenwissenschaft. The task of the foundation to look after his oeuvre long term, today one would say sustainably, would not have been possible in this way. As endowment capital, Elias transferred the copyrights and thus all income from this publication to the foundation. He also appointed Joop, Bram van Stolk, and me as board members. Elias then dictated his will, in which the foundation was appointed as his sole heir. It is no secret that the personal decisions were not welcomed by everyone in Elias' immediate entourage. But since it was the master himself who had made the decision, there were no public criticism. But Joop, Bram, and I were aware that there were these critics. Thus, from the very beginning, we were keenly aware of the necessity to deal cautiously with the task assigned to us. This was not difficult in the first few years, as the foundation hardly appeared to the outside world. If we had any problems, they were more with the generous founder, who did not quite understand why he could not live directly on the substantial revenue generated with his books. Since he all the same needed assistance in his ongoing work, funds had to be raised from other foundations. That worked out quite well, but it wasn't always easy to absorb and endure the fluctuations in his moods. Even older people can suddenly be very unfair. This unfortunately also applies to great minds and humanists. The impact of this was primarily borne by Job and Maria, as Elias lived permanently on the two upper floors of Waterstraat 13th since 1984. I remember one particular absurd conflict that forced me to drive from southern Germany to Amsterdam at once in order to resolve it. Job was rather helpless in such situations, as introverted as he was. Maria, however, was truly angry and threatened to terminate Elias' rental agreement, but it turned out well. On the whole, it was a productive time, especially for Job, who began to work on his book, Fire and Civilization, his opus magnum. Conversations with him about it became more and more interesting the deeper he worked into the research results of neighboring fields. But it also meant that the times he spent alone in his study were getting longer and longer. The following invitation to Oxford's All Souls College for a year focused his work situation even further. There he was able to pursue his research work all day long without any further obligations. And the conviviality was also quite something. Lunch at the high table, dinner in a separé with colleagues, with excellent food and very good wines, dress code, black tie. Then came the 90th birthday of Elias. Some of those present today were also present at that time. These days in June 1987 had been prepared for a long time by us, who had to do all this in addition to our work at university, our own writing projects, and our family life. Even though we got help from many sides, I still sometimes wonder today how we managed. Today's digital possibilities for fast communication across borders were, of course, not yet available to us. After 1987, the scope of necessary assistance for Norbert Elias' everyday life increased. Most of it was done by friends in Amsterdam, but I also went to visit Elias in the Waterstraat on an almost monthly basis during the last 2 years of his life. I always stopped by Job and Maria at the kitchen table. Bram often joined us for half an hour. I mention this frequent, almost regular meetings because it strengthens the basis of trust between Job, Maria, Bram, and myself. We always knew what was happening around Elias and what the foundation had to do. This was the basis for our joint work for the time after the death of Norbert Elias on 1st of August 1990. On this sad day, the Norbert Elias Foundation took over the inheritance, began the active work that continues to this day. The history of the foundation will undoubtedly be the subject of some researcher of a younger generation one day. I adhere, and not only today, to Bacon's motto, de nobis ipsis silemus. We are silent about ourselves. I will only briefly report on 2 early decisions as they were taken upon Job's proposal. First, the sale of the Elias legacy to the German Literature Archive in Marbach am Neckar. There were other possibilities, such as the International Institute of Social History here in Amsterdam. But here the opportunity arose to hand over the estate of a German Jew who, as he once put it out, had lived in England for a long time, to this renowned research institute. They offered a good price, but it took Job's voice to tip the scales. The negotiations with Christoph König, then head of the Marbach Research Department, took place in Job's study. We have never regretted our decision for Marbach. The entire estate is well organized there and is available to interest parties from all over the world at any time and is still actively used today. The second decision concerns the German complete edition, which we tackled about 3 years after everything else had been settled so far. Job, Bram, and I deliberately refrained from publishing the issue ourselves, but agreed to entrust this to an editorial board. Thus, we do not appear by name. It simply reads, published on behalf of the Norbert Elias Foundation, followed by the 5 names of the editorial board. Nobody should think that we didn't have a lot of work with the edition, and not to forget with the editors, but the 3 of us agreed, de nobis ipsis silemus. In the mid-1990s, the foundation was well positioned. Job, Bram, and I cooperated trustfully and had the joy of successful projects and international conferences. The reception of Norbert Elias progressed well. The work on, with, and through his theoretical and methodological proposals. It could have gone on so harmoniously for the 3 of us, but it wasn't to be. In those years, the first wave of the AIDS virus raged in Western Europe and did not spare Amsterdam. The virus had a very high death rate with no therapies available. Among the early victims was Bram's partner Rudolf Kneif, longtime assistant of Elias, and after his death of the foundation. Rudolf died on 28th of September 1994. In the spring of 1996, I remember it as I do it today. Bram called me very late one evening to tell me that he, too, had become infected. This news came as a shock for everyone who knew Bram, including Job and me, as we knew about the mortal danger. The disease took a rapid course in Bram. About 14 days before his death, Job and I were able to visit him at his house, where he was cared for. The 3 of us tried to create a relaxed atmosphere, but knew that we would not meet again. The visit was a farewell. On our back way to Viotastraat, Job and I were very silent. We had known that Bram was going to die, but that this terrible disease could change a person shook us very much. Bram died on 20th of November, 1996. In my memory, and this is what we are talking about here today, Bram's death was a serious turning point. But so that no misunderstanding arises, the foundation continued to work, of course. Bram got a successor, as did the entire foundation's board in 2016. Perhaps one day I will report on this. Better yet, someone from the next generation or the generation after that will write about it. But for me, it was a break with a coherent, harmonious time. I often sat at the kitchen table in the Viotastraat, first with Maria and Job, then later, after Maria's death, with Job alone. In the first years, he was still full of confidence, but then the infirmities of old age increased. He felt weak, and on the phone, his voice became quieter and quieter. When the news of his death reached me, I remembered a line from the poem "At the Grave of My Father" by Matthias Claudius, in translation. Oh, they buried a good man, and to me he was more. Yes, Job was more to me. That is what I wanted to tell you today. Thank you all for listening.